Chapter 9, which is about a fantastic crossing of the dried-up sea, and how the Snork Maiden rescues Moomintroll from a giant octopus. On the 5th of October, the birds stopped singing. The sun was so pale that you could hardly see it at all, and over the wood the comet hung like a cartwheel, surrounded by a ring of fire. Snufkin didn't play his mouth-organ that day. He was very quiet and thought to himself, "I haven't felt so depressed for a long time. I usually feel sad, in a way, when a good party is over, but this is something different. It's horrible when the sun is gone and the forest is silent." The others hadn't much to say either. Sniff had a headache and was grumbling to himself. Their feet were tired after so much dancing, and progress was a bit slow. Gradually the trees thinned out, and by a landscape of deserted sand dunes lay before them. Nothing but soft sandy hillocks with here and there tufts of blue-grey sea oats. "I can smell the sea," said Moomintroll, sniffing. "Phew, it's hot."
"Perhaps this is a desert,"
said Sniff. On and on they went, up one hill and down another, and it was heavy going on the soft sand. "Look," said the Snork suddenly, "the Hatty-Fatteners are on the move again." And sure enough, there in the distance was a wavering line of little figures. "They're going east," said the Snork. "Perhaps we'd better follow them, because they always know where danger lies and try to get away from it." "But we must go this way," said Moomintroll. "The valley is to the west."
"I'm so thirsty,"
wailed Sniff, but nobody answered. Tired and discouraged, they struggled on. The sand dunes gradually got flatter and flatter, and then stopped at a line of seaweed glistening in the red light. Beyond this was a pebbly beach, and then they stood in a row and stared.
"Whoa, strike me pink,"
said Moomintroll. Where the sea should have been, with soft blue waves and friendly sails, there gaped a yawning abyss. Hot steam rose from the depths of great cracks that seemed to go down to the very heart of the earth, and below them the cliff went down, down.
"Moomintroll,"
gasped the Snork Maiden,
"the whole sea has dried up." "What will the fishes say to that?"
exclaimed Sniff. The Snork took out his exercise book and added something to the list headed "Risks Encountered During Approach of Comet." But Snufkin sat down with his head in his hands and wailed.
Oh dear, the beautiful sea, quite gone. No more sailing, no more swimming, no more fishing. No great storms, no transparent ice, and no gleaming black water reflecting the stars. Finished, lost, gone."
And he put his head on his knees and cried as if his heart would break.
"But Snuff,"
said Moomintroll reproachfully,
"you have always been so happy-go-lucky. It's dreadful to see you despairing like this." "I know," said Snufkin, "but I've always loved the sea more than anything else. This is so sad." "Especially for the fish,"
squeaked Sniff. "What seems to be most important," said the Snork, "is how we are going to get across this huge gap, because we haven't got time to go round it."
"No, of course not,"
Moomintroll agreed anxiously.
"Let's hold a meeting," said the Snork. "I will take the chair. Now, what alternatives have we for crossing a dried-up sea?"
"Flying,"
said Sniff.
"Don't be silly," said the Snork. "Proposal rejected. Unanimously. Well?"
"Walking," suggested Moomintroll.
"You are stupid," said the Snork. "We should fall down those great cracks, or sink into the mud. Proposal rejected." "Propose something yourself, then," said Moomintroll angrily. Then Snufkin lifted his head. "I know," he cried. "Stilts." "Stilts?" said the Snork. "Proposal "Wait a minute," cried Snufkin. "Listen. Don't you remember how I used stilts in the land of the hot springs? In one stride I could get over practically anything. It's quick, too."
"But isn't it awfully difficult to walk on stilts?"
asked the Snork Maiden.
"Well, you can practice here on the beach," answered Snufkin. "Now it's only a question of finding stilts."
So they all set off in different directions on a stilt hunt, and it wasn't a very easy hunt either. The Snork faced the problem most sensibly. He thought, stilts are long poles. What are poles? They are tree trunks. Where are their tree trunks? In the wood. And so he went all the long hot way back to the edge of the wood, and got a pair of slender fir saplings for himself. There are no tree spirits in the fir. Moomintroll and the Snork Maiden hunted together. They talked about Moomin Valley and the cave, and soon completely forgot what they were hunting for.
"My papa has built a wonderful bridge," said Moomintroll for about the third time, "but mostly he writes in a book called Memoirs. It's all about what he has done in his life, and as soon as he does anything else, he writes that down too."
"Then surely he hasn't got time to do very much,"
said the Snork Maiden.
"Oh, well," said Moomintroll, "he makes sure of doing things now and again, even if it's only to give himself something to write about."
"Tell me about that terrible flood you had,"
said the Snork Maiden.
"Oh, yes, it was dreadful," said Moomintroll. "The water just rose and rose, until in the end Mamma and Sniff and I were standing on a little mound with hardly room even for our tails."
"Phew,"
said the Snork Maiden.
"how high was the water?"
5 times higher than I am, or perhaps more," said Moomintroll. "About as high as that pole over there."
"Fancy!"
exclaimed the Snork Maiden, and they wandered on thinking about the flood. After a while Moomintroll stopped and asked,
"Didn't I say as high as that pole over there?"
"Yes, why?"
asked the Snork Maiden.
"Because I've just remembered we're looking for poles," Moomintroll answered. "We must go back and fetch it."
They trudged back along the beach till they found the pole again. It was very long and painted red and white.
"It's one of those posts they use at sea to mark rocks from one side," said Moomintroll. "And there's the one for the other side."
They were in what had been a little bay before the sea had dried up, and the beach was littered with wreckage, piles of driftwood, birch bark, and seaweed. The Snork Maiden found the knob off the top of a ship's mast, but it was too big to take with them. Instead, she picked up a bottle with a gilded stopper which had drifted all the way from Mexico, and soon afterwards they came across a very long plank which, broken in two, would do very well for the second pair of stilts. They set off back very pleased with themselves, and found the others already practising. Snufkin was demonstrating proudly on a fishing rod and a hop pole, and Sniff was trying to keep his balance on a broomstick and the pole that still had their flag on the end of it.
"You ought to have seen me a minute ago,"
he cried, and immediately fell smack on his nose.
"Oh, you have to do it like this,"
said the Snork, climbing over a sandbank.
"Oh, it's like wearing 7-league boots."
The Snork Maiden whimpered with fright when they hoisted her up on her stilts, but after a time she was better than any of them, strutting about with such an air that you'd have thought she had worn them all her life.
"I think that's pretty good now," said Snufkin, when they had been balancing and staggering and falling for an hour or so. "Let's start."
One after another, with their stilts under their arms, they began to climb down the difficult slippery path to the abyss. It was very depressing down there on the sea bottom. The seaweed, which looked so beautiful waving in green transparent water, was all flat and black, and the fish floundered pathetically in half-dried-up pools. The steam was like a smoke-screen above them, and through it the comet shone with a dim, eerie light.
"It's almost the same as the land of the hot springs," said Snufkin.
"It smells awful,"
said Sniff, wrinkling his nose.
"Don't forget I'm not to blame for this. I warned you."
"How goes it?"
cried Moomintroll to the Snork Maiden through the steam.
"Fine, thanks,"
came a faint answering cry. And on they stalked, like long-legged insects, across the bottom of the sea, while the ground sloped gradually down. Here and there great dark green mountains rose. Their tops had once been little islands where people had landed, and children enjoyed themselves splashing about in the water.
"Never again will I swim in deep water,"
said Sniff with a shiver.
"Just to think that all this was underneath."
He squinted down a dark cleft where there was still some water left, and no doubt a strange swarming underwater life.
"But it's beautiful, although it's so awful," said Snufkin, "and nobody has ever been here before us. What's that over there?"
"A treasure chest!"
screamed Sniff.
"Oh, let's go and see."
"We can't take it with us anyhow," said the Snork. "Let it be. I expect we shall find even more extraordinary things before we get through this place." Now they were moving between jagged black rocks, and had to go very carefully for fear of the stilts getting caught. Suddenly, in the gloom in front of them, a great dark shape loomed up.
"What's that?"
gasped Moomintroll, stopping so suddenly that he nearly fell on his nose.
Perhaps it's something that bites,"
said Sniff anxiously. Slowly they advanced and peeped at the shape from behind a rock.
"A ship?" exclaimed the Snork. "A shipwreck?"
How miserable she looked, poor ship. Her mast was broken, and barnacles covered her rotted hull. Her sails and rigging had long ago been swept away by the current, and her golden figurehead was cracked and discoloured.
"Do you think there's anybody on board?"
whispered the Snork Maiden.
"Well, I expect they were rescued by a lifeboat," said Moomintroll. "Come away, this is horrible."
"Wait a minute,"
said Sniff, hopping down from his stilts.
"I can see something gold, something shining."
"Remember what happened with the garnets and the giant lizard," called Snufkin. "Much better let it be."
But Sniff bent down and pulled a dagger with a golden hilt out of the sand. It was set with opals that shone like moonlight, and the blade gleamed coldly. Sniff lifted up his find and shouted with excitement.
"Oh, so beautiful!"
exclaimed the Snork Maiden, and completely lost her balance. She rocked backwards and forwards and suddenly shot right over the side of the ship and disappeared into the hold. Moomintroll let out one shriek and dashed to her rescue. His rush was slightly held up by the slipperiness of the deck, but he was soon peering down into the dark hold.
"Are you there?"
he cried anxiously.
"Yes, I'm here,"
piped the Snork Maiden.
"Are you all right?"
asked Moomintroll, jumping down to her, and finding with a shock that the water came up to his middle, and that it had a horrible stagnant smell.
"I'm all right,"
said the Snork Maiden.
"Only so frightened."
"Sniff is an absolute pest,"
said Moomintroll furiously.
"Always wanting to run after everything that shines or glitters."
"Well, I do understand him,"
said the Snork Maiden.
"Ornaments are such fun, especially if they're made of gold and jewels. Don't you think we might find some more treasure in here?"
"Oh, it's so dark,"
said Moomintroll. And there may be dangerous animals about.
Yes, I suppose you're right,
said the Snork Maiden obediently.
Be a kind Moomintroll then and help me out of here.
So Moomintroll lifted her onto the edge of the hatchway. The Snork Maiden immediately took out her looking-glass to see if it was broken, but, thank goodness, the glass was whole and all the rubies were still on the back. But as she was titivating herself, a horrifying picture came into the looking-glass. There was the dark hold, and there was Moomintroll, who was just climbing out. But behind, in a dark corner, there was something else, something that moved, something that crept slowly nearer to Moomintroll. The Snork Maiden threw down the looking-glass and yelled with all her might,
Look out! There's something behind you!
Moomintroll looked over his shoulder, and what he saw was a huge octopus, the most dangerous of deep-sea creatures, squirming slowly out of a corner towards him. He tried desperately to clamber up and reach the Snork Maiden's paw, but he slid back on the slimy planks and splashed into the water. By this time Snufkin and the others had come up on the deck to see what was happening, and they tried to poke the octopus with their stilts, but it didn't have the slightest effect on him. He just crept relentlessly nearer to Moomintroll, his long tentacles already groping after his prey. Then the Snork Maiden had an idea. She had often played with a looking-glass in the sun, making its reflection shine into her brother's eyes to dazzle him. So now she picked up her ruby looking-glass and tried the same thing against the octopus, only shining the comet instead of the sun into his eyes. It was most successful. The octopus stopped at once, and while he was dazzled and didn't know what to do, Moomintroll clambered up by his stilts and was hauled on deck by the others. They left that dreadful ship without wasting any time, and hardly drew breath before they were several sea miles away from it. Then Moomintroll said to the Snork Maiden,
You saved my life, you know, and in such a clever way, too. I shall ask Snufkin to write a poem in your honour, because I'm afraid I can't write poetry myself.
The Snork Maiden lowered her eyes and began to change colour with pleasure.
I was very happy to do it,
she whispered.
I would save your life 8 times a day if only I could.
And I wouldn't mind 8 octopuses attacking me every day if I could only be saved from them by you,
said Moomintroll gallantly.
If you've quite finished babbling to each other, said Sniff, perhaps we could go on.
The sand had got more even now, and there were huge shells with horns and spirals in the most wonderful colours, such as purple, midnight blue, and sea green, strewn about all over the place. The Snork Maiden wanted to stay and admire every one, and listen to the call of the sea which lay hidden inside them, but the Snork hurried her on. Enormous crabs were sidling in and out between the shells, telling each other how strange it was that the water had disappeared. They wondered who had taken it away and when it would come back.
"Thank goodness I'm not a jellyfish,"
said one.
"Out of the water they're nothing but miserable little splodges. But we, of course, are equally happy wherever we are."
I feel so sorry for anybody who wasn't born a crab, said another. It's quite possible that this drying up of the sea has been arranged especially so that we shall have more space to live in.
What an excellent thought! Why not a world peopled entirely by crabs?
Exclaimed a third, waving his claws. Self-satisfied creatures, muttered Snufkin. Try dazzling them with the looking-glass, and see if they know what to do then.
The Snork Maiden fixed the comet's reflection again, and shone it in the crab's eyes. There was a terrible upheaval. Chattering with fright, the crabs rushed wildly in all directions, knocking each other over on the way, and buried their heads in pools of water. Moomintroll and the others had a good laugh, and went on their way. And after a while, Snufkin thought he would play a time. But not a sound could he get out of his mouth-organ. The steam had rusted it up. "Oh, dear," he said sadly.
"This is about the worst thing that could happen."
"Papa will mend it for you when we get home," said Moomintroll. "He can mend anything, if only he gets around to it." All about them stretched the strange sea landscape, which had been covered by millions of tons of water since the beginning of the world. "You know, it's rather solemn to be down here," said the Snork. "We must be pretty near the deepest part of the ocean by now." But when they reached the biggest chasm of all, they didn't dare go down. The sides sloped steeply, and the bottom was obscured in green gloom. Perhaps there was no bottom. Perhaps the biggest octopuses in the world lived down there, brooding in the slime, creatures that nobody had ever seen, far less imagined. But the Snork Maiden gazed longingly at an enormous and beautiful shell that was poised on the very brink of the chasm. It was a lovely pale colour, only to be found in the depths of the sea where no light penetrates, and its dusky heart glowed temptingly. The shell sang softly to herself the age-old song of the sea.
"Oh,"
sighed the Snork Maiden,
"I should like to live in that shell. I want to go inside and see who is whispering in there."
"It's only the sea," said Moomintroll. "Every wave that dies on the beach sings a little song to a shell. But you mustn't go inside, because it's a labyrinth, and you may never come out again." So she was at last persuaded to go on, and they started to hurry, as dusk was falling, and they had not found anywhere to sleep. They could only see soft outlines of each other through the damp sea mist, and it was uncannily silent. There were none of the small sounds that liven up the evening on land, the pattering of small animal feet, leaves moving in the night breeze, the cry of a bird, of a stone dislodged by somebody's foot. A fire would never draw on that damp ground, and they dared not sleep amongst the unknown dangers that might be lurking about. So in the end they decided to pitch camp on a high pointed rock which they could just reach by their stilts. They had to keep watch, so Moomintroll took the first, and decided to take the Snork Maidens too. And while the others curled up tightly together and slept, he sat staring out over the desolate sea bottom. It was lit by the red glow of the comet, and shadows like black velvet lay across the sand. Moomintroll thought how frightened the earth must be feeling with that great ball of fire coming nearer and nearer to her. Then he thought about how much he loved everything, the forest and the sea, the rain and the wind, the sunshine, the grass and the moss, and how impossible it would be to live without them all, and this made him feel very, very sad. But after a while he stopped worrying. "Mamma will know what to do," he said to himself.